begin with a brief discussion of the gender symmetry debate in the field. You've seen one answer to that debate. I'll give you a different answer to that debate. The debate about whether women are as violent as men in intimate relationships has been going on now for over 30 years. And when I first started working in this area 20 years ago, I was astonished that we didn't seem to be able to answer the most basic question about intimate partner violence: who does it? So it raised the question for me as to why there appears to be contradictory data that supports both sides of this argument. And it's in trying to answer that question that I came to the conclusion that there are different types of intimate partner violence, and that different kinds of research tap those different types and come to different conclusions about the role of gender in intimate partner violence. Addressing this issue is important for a number of reasons. Of course, in terms of the development of theory and understanding of intimate partner violence, but it's important also politically. I'm not going to dwell on this today, but in North America now, there's a strong backlash against the women's movement. There's a small group of people who are arguing, unlike Professor Strauss, who are arguing that we need to devote more of our resources to helping male victims of so-called battering. And one of the sources of their evidence for the need to shift resources over to male victims is the evidence that they present that there's gender symmetry in intimate partner violence. So what you see on this slide is just a couple of examples of this political movement. Now here are the data, here are the contradictory data that seem to be able to support both sides. People who argue that women are as violent as men in intimate partner relationships cite general survey data. And what I've put up here, I'll just warn you, you'll see numbers in my slides. I can't keep myself from doing that. Don't get too focused on the specific numbers. Whenever I show you a set of numbers, what you'll see is a general pattern that appears in study after study. In this list of studies, you see they range from the 1970s up to current times. They're done in different studies, they're done with different age groups, and they all show rough gender symmetry, or, as Dr. Strauss pointed out, for younger groups, that women are more likely than men to perpetrate intimate partner violence. On the other hand, the side of the debate that says, no, this is primarily a male-perpetrated crime, you look at data from agency studies. So here again, the studies range from the 1960s to current studies. They deal with different aspects of intimate partner violence, spousal homicide, partner assault. They come from different kinds of agencies, not just shelters, but from police statistics, from emergency room statistics, from the family courts, and so on. And they show, and I could put up hundreds of these studies as well, they show repeatedly that men are the primary perpetrators of intimate partner violence. So why is it that these two groups of studies seem to consistently find very different gendered patterns? Well, I think the reason has to do with three important things. The first is that there is more than one type of intimate partner violence. Second, the different types of intimate partner violence are differently gendered. Some are gender symmetric, others are perpetrated primarily by women, others perpetrated primarily by men. And third, and very important, is that the two major sampling plans that we use in research on intimate partner violence are both biased. General survey studies are biased because they do not give us information about random samples of respondents. They start with random samples, and then in the typical survey, 40% of those people refuse to participate in the survey. So what happens is that in general survey data, what you get is a bias, a very strong bias, in the direction of situationally provoked violence. I'll talk more about what these different types are. But a bias towards situationally provoked violence, which is perpetrated about equally by men and women. And those are the hundreds of studies that Professor Strauss cites. The agency studies are biased in their own way. They're biased not by refusals, but they're biased by the nature of the sampling frame itself. There was a question asked, why aren't we getting certain kinds of cases at the agencies? Well, of course, who comes to the agencies? It's people who need help for a pattern of chronic, coercive, controlling violence. And that kind of violence in heterosexual relationships is perpetrated almost entirely by men. So the agency studies, therefore, are showing decided gender asymmetry. Well, this is a little theory. So we didn't have evidence on this because the literature typically doesn't make these distinctions. So in survey research, nobody looks at differences among the major types, or had until recently. Similarly, in agency studies, people didn't distinguish among the different types of intimate partner violence. So I'll go on now to talk about the nature of the different types and give you some of the evidence on the differences among them. Part of that evidence will explain this ostensibly contradictory data. The three major types of intimate partner violence that I discussed are distinguished not in terms of the specific acts of violence, whether they're mild or severe or frequent or infrequent, but they're distinguished in terms of the interpersonal dynamic that produces the violence. So intimate terrorism involves a pattern of violent, coercive control, a situation in which one of the partners attempts to take general control over the relationship, over his partner's behavior. This kind of violence takes place in both heterosexual and same-sex relationships. In heterosexual relationships, it's perpetrated almost entirely by men. Violent resistance is the use of violence to resist an intimate partner. Some of the mutual violence that we see in the intimate partner violence literature comes from a partner resisting an attempt to take general control over her behavior. I'm not saying it's self-defense, but it's violence that is in reaction to an attempt by the other partner to take violent, coercive control over your life. And the third type of violence, the most common kind of violence between partners, is situational couple violence. That's violence that's provoked by situations. I'll elaborate on these a bit. Intimate terrorism involves a pattern of violent, coercive control, an attempt to exert general control. It involves, and the way we identify it in research is by looking for a pattern of both violent and nonviolent coercive control tactics. Many of you have seen the power and control wheel. That captures it graphically very nicely. You have a pattern of violence that adds a terrorism to the use of the other less violent tactics that are used to take control over one's partner. In heterosexual relationships, it's primarily, but not exclusively, perpetrated by men. There are a small number of heterosexual relationships in which women are able to terrorize their male partners, but most of the perpetration goes in the other direction. Research by Professor Holdsworth Monroe, who's here today, has identified two major subtypes of intimate terrorists. There are those men, and she studied only men, there are those men who are extremely emotionally dependent on their partners and are trying to exert general control, to simplify a bit, out of a desperate need to keep their partner, a concern over losing their partner. So they somewhat ironically engage in tactics to keep her that probably will ultimately drive her out of the relationship. The second type is the antisocial intimate terrorist. These are men who are willing to use violence in other aspects of their life as well. They're not necessarily emotionally dependent on their partner. They simply want to control her. If they lose her, they'll move on and find somebody else to control. Violent resistance, resisting the intimate terrorist. Many victims respond with violence. That's not surprising when you're being terrorized by your partner, that one of the tactics to stop that you may try is violent resistance. Does not necessarily involve self-defense. In many cases, it involves retribution, that one wants to get even, that one wants one's partner to pay a price for what he's doing to you. The evidence suggests that in heterosexual relationships, although there are many women who at some point attempt to stop the violence by reacting with violence of their own, most violent resistors desist and turn to other tactics to mitigate the violence or to escape from the relationship. Well, the third And I'll repeat, the most common kind of violence between partners is situational couple violence. This involves conflicts that turn into arguments that escalate to aggression that then escalates further to physical violence. Both men and women do this. This is largely gender symmetric in terms of perpetration, although it is important, as Professor Strauss pointed out, that men's violence is clearly more likely to injure and to frighten the partner. An important characteristic of this type of violence is extreme variability. Intimate terrorism, you see, is pretty much the same pattern, although different intimate terrorists may use different tactics. In all cases, what you see is a general pattern, an attempt to take general control over the partner. In situational couple violence, you see tremendous variability. The evidence suggests that probably in about 40% of the cases of situational couple violence, there's only one incident. Something happens between the couple that leads one or both of them to escalate to violence. They work it out, they're horrified by what they've done, and they never do it again. But situational couple violence can involve chronic and severe violence, even life-threatening violence. And so we need to deal with those cases as well. But tremendous variability. There's also tremendous variability in the causes of situational couple violence. Sometimes the cause has to do with one partner's problem, a partner who has trouble with anger management issues, for example, or with substance abuse problems. Other times, it's both partners. They may both have anger management problems. So I've listed here some of the causes of situational couple violence that have been identified. Those causes will differ from case to case, and in order to intervene effectively, you need to figure out what the causes are in the particular case that you're dealing with. Now, let me show you a little bit of the evidence on this. Okay, if you look across the rows in this table, this is a study in which we made the distinction among the major types of intimate partner violence by looking for patterns of high coercive control and then distinguishing among the types on the basis of that. And in this particular study, for intimate terrorism, 97% of the intimate terrorists were the husbands in this study. The violent resistors, 96% of the women. So when I say some types of intimate partner violence are perpetrated primarily by men, I'm talking about intimate terrorism. When I say some types of intimate partner violence are perpetrated primarily by women, I'm talking about violent resistance. Now, remember, this is not situation focused. This is focused on the relationship as a whole. In a particular incident in these types of violence may look much the same. You need to look at the relationship pattern in order to identify the differences. And you see here, if you look across the bottom row in the main table, that situational couple violence in this study was roughly gender symmetric in its perpetration. The numbers at the bottom are from a study done in Britain by other researchers using other measures with other samples and find basically the same pattern: intimate terrorism perpetrated primarily by men, violent resistance by women, situational couple violence roughly gender symmetric in terms of perpetration. Now let's look at the sampling issue. We know the different types are gendered differently. What happens when you look at what kinds of violence appear in which kinds of samples? Now look down the columns in this study. Look at the column headed general sample. In the Pittsburgh study, from which I'm taking this data, 86% of the violence in the general sample, this was a neighborhood sample, was situational couple violence. In the court sample, these were women who had filed for protection from abuse orders. 68% of the violence was intimate terrorism, and I have 5 minutes left. Notice, however, it's important to notice that 29% of the violence was situational couple violence. And let me go on to the shelter sample, which will be of interest to many of you. In the shelters, even more of the violence was intimate terrorism, but notice the minority, 18% of the violence, that was situational couple violence. In shelters and in the courts, we are getting some of the more severe cases and chronic cases of situational couple violence, where women feel that they need protection from their partner and turn to the courts or to shelters for help. I'm going to show you just a few more of the dramatic differences among these types to nail down my point that they're different. If we want to intervene in them, we need to use different tactics for intervention. Intimate terrorism. In the Pittsburgh study, 76% of the cases of intimate terrorism had involved severe violence, as compared to only 28% of the situational couple violence. But I want to emphasize that 28% can be life-threatening. I don't want anybody to go out of here thinking I'm saying that situational couple violence is not a problem, that it's necessarily less severe. It can be severe violence. We need to intervene in it, but probably use different means of intervening than we do for intimate terrorism. On the issue of escalation, which came up in Professor Strauss's comments, intimate terrorism, 75% escalated. For situational couple violence, only 28% escalated. In fact, more de-escalated over time than escalated, a pattern that's found frequently in general survey research, which is dominated by situational couple violence. In intimate terrorism, 29% of the violence was mutual, in the sense they had both been violent about the same number of times. And in situational couple violence, much more mutual violence than in intimate terrorism. Probably because in intimate terrorism, although women resist with violence, at some point in the relationship, they then desist. Notice the numbers, the pattern at least. Please don't get too tied to the specific numbers. I would argue that one out of 25 couples maybe experiences intimate terrorism, 1 out of 8 experiences situational couple violence. This is the last of the data and the end of my presentation. Look at the differences between the column for situational couple violence and for intimate terrorism. The first 2 rows deal with injury and PTSD. What you see is dramatically higher rates of injury for intimate terrorism and dramatically higher rates of post-traumatic stress symptomology for intimate terrorism. In terms of the nature of the relationship, leaving the relationship more than once, quite high for intimate terrorism, fairly low for situational couple violence. Here's the next row. Gender traditionalism is important. This is from a meta-analysis, a study of all of the research that had been done up to the time that the meta-analysis had been done. What those numbers there indicate is that the minus 0.14 suggests that gender traditionalism is slightly negatively related to situational couple violence, that men who are more traditional are slightly less likely to get into situational couple violence with their partners than men who are very traditional. On the other hand, there's a very strong positive relationship with intimate terrorism, that men who are highly traditional in terms of their gender attitudes are clearly more likely to be involved in intimate terrorism than men who are not strongly traditional. In terms of marriage, when couples leave cohabitation and move into marriage, they're less likely to be involved in situational couple violence. They're more likely to be involved in intimate terrorism. So in some sense, for some men, the marriage license is a license to hit. But that has to do with that coercive controlling dynamic, not with arguments that escalate to violence. And finally, on the issue of what you learn in your childhood, another meta-analysis that looked at all the studies that look at the relationship between the experience of violence in your childhood home and your experiences with violence as an adult. There's a relatively small relationship with situational couple violence, a fairly robust relationship with intimate terrorism. These are just examples. There are many other examples of things in the literature that we find are dramatically different for these different types of violence. So a major point here again is there are different types of intimate partner violence. We can't understand intimate partner violence by treating it as if it were a unitary phenomenon. We have to recognize the differences and intervene as is appropriate for the type of violence that we're dealing with. We make big mistakes if we don't make these distinctions, and much of the literature is still not making these distinctions. So when you see a study on intimate partner violence, you have to ask yourself, what kind of violence is this study addressing? If it's a general sample survey, it's heavily dominated by situational couple violence. If it's an agency study, it's probably heavily dominated by intimate terrorism, although it depends on what kind of agency you're looking at. You saw that for shelters and for courts, you see some of the violence is situational couple violence. If you were to look at family counseling, for example, the clients who come to family counseling are going to be mostly situational couple violence. The intimate terrorists and their partners don't come in and volunteer for counseling about their violence. So you need to ask yourself whenever you see a study, what's the nature of the sample? What's the balance of the types? Thank you.